Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones, directed by George Lucas, co-written by George Lucas. I forget the name of the other screenwriter, but he co-wrote the screenplay for this. Just a random detail I noticed when I was rewatching this last night. Rather than waiting another couple of months to talk about Attack of the Clones, I wanted to really get right to the point and finish my thoughts on the prequel trilogy. Because a little tease for you guys, I'm actually planning on doing something special with each of the next two films. I'm going to review each one as I normally do, but I'm also going to do a bonus video for each film. But with Star Wars Attack of the Clones, set about 10 years after the events of Phantom Menace, Anakin Skywalker, a Padawan in the Jedi Order, is now a full-grown young man, starting to develop a romance with Padme Amidala, with some friction between him and Obi-Wan, and all the while, a civil war is starting to brew in the Republic. I'll be honest, it's been quite a while since I watched this in its entirety, but I can still remember a few parts, mostly because of the clips that I would see on YouTube, and to be honest, I avoided this movie like the plague for years. Especially that it was once considered the worst of all the Star Wars films, let alone the prequel trilogy. But I wanted to try to go back to it and give it an honest look, and to be honest with you, it's okay. I know that's not really saying much, but I do think it's better than the Phantom Menace.
What did you say?
Just let me explain. If you somehow have never seen this movie after 22 years, well, I'm about to spoil the entire thing for you. After the release of The Phantom Menace, with fans being disappointed on how the film was constructed, it was still regarded as a financial success, but with critics and audiences, not so much. There was still an element of fan anticipation going into Attack of the Clones that we're hoping that George Lucas had listened to some of the complaints that fans had with the previous film. But for the most part, all we get is really more or less the same type of movie that The Phantom Menace was, albeit a little more interesting than its predecessor. And Jar Jar Binks is nowhere near in it as much as he was in the last one. Although a certain choice that George Lucas makes with him is,
Well, we'll get to that later.
If I sound a little off here, I apologize. My hay fever has been really bad this week, so bear with me as I try to power through this review. As per usual with the Star Wars saga films, we get the opening crawl explaining what's been going on in the last 10 years. The galaxy starting to split apart with a confederacy of independent systems, and there's an assassination plot going on against Padme Amidala, who's now the senator of Naboo. Now, I realize that this is a nitpick, but how does that work exactly? Doesn't a senator have to work her or his way towards royalty or something? It's Star Wars, it's Naboo, they have their own rules, I guess. Who knows? Not a deal breaker or anything, but I always found that kind of odd, if anything. The film opens with a pretty abrupt explosion on a certain landing platform when Padme's decoy gets killed during an assassination attempt. It kind of makes you think that Padme's on the big star cruiser that's coming in, and then it turns out she's a pilot on a Naboo starfighter. Then the next scene we get is the Jedi sitting with Chancellor Palpatine talking about how the Republic is splitting up. The big problem with this aspect, unfortunately, is that we don't really get an understanding as to why these planets are splitting off in the first place. I think I might have mentioned this in my Phantom Menace review earlier this year, but I could be wrong. I know Goldman mentioned this in his Phantom Menace video last year. What if they actually went along the lines of, there's been some tension boiling in the Senate and the House of Representatives for the Republic, and when the Republic ignored Naboo's call for aid, that pushed certain systems over the edge, causing the split to happen. I realize that's a lot of information to cram into a 2-hour or so movie, but even then, I think at least one scene or maybe two would have really helped. Because we do see Viceroy Gunray show up, and he's hell-bent on some kind of revenge against Senator Amidala. As per usual, he doesn't really get to do anything of value other than just standing around, acting so bewildered and getting so excited when Padme gets scratched by that one creature in the arena, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. Since we're on the subject of the politics of this whole thing, I do like the idea of George Lucas's political commentary and, I guess, parallels to real-life stories and situations throughout world history. For anyone who didn't go to elementary school or didn't pay attention in history class, we obviously know that there was an American Civil War in the 1800s. The Confederacy of Independent Systems is, I think, a nod to that era of American history. I mean, the Galactic Senate, the Galactic House, and all that other stuff, that's more or less the United States government in the Star Wars universe. And this, I think, is really what George Lucas is more interested in talking about. How democracies lose their way and become some form of government that people thought that they wanted, but they actually didn't. We'll go more in depth with that with Revenge of the Sith, but I think it's a really neat concept to explore. I just wish that he gave an equal amount of time to the characters, which he does give some attention to Anakin and Padme, and that's really the main focus throughout all three of these movies. But I think that a little equal amount of attention, along with all of the political stuff that he had in the background, would have really helped. Actually, I think they would have really complemented each other. I don't really think it's necessary to point out the stale acting. It's more or less the same kind of stuff, with Ian McDiarmid just sitting in his chair in the office going,
I will not let this republic that has stood for 1,000 years be split in two. My negotiations will not fail.
I mean, if I was in his position, I would put on some kind of a front that I'd be worried about what's going to happen. Now, obviously, we know what his secret intentions are by trying to cause a war. I would at least try to throw off suspicion some way, or at least put some kind of energy in there. And with the Jedi, it's the exact same problem. The only characters that really seem to act, if anything, like human beings is Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker. Anakin Skywalker, unfortunately, in this film got the most backlash, along with Natalie Portman's portrayal of Padme, but Anakin really gets the crux of all the backlash, just like Jar Jar did in The Phantom Menace. Once we're introduced to Anakin and Obi-Wan, we do really get a good sense of how their bond has grown over the last 10 years. Though for the rest of the movie, all they really seem to do most of the time is arguing and bickering with each other. Now, Mr. Sunday Movies had pointed out in his Caravan of Garbage video on Attack of the Clones that they're trying to make the best of an awkward situation where they don't exactly like each other. Qui-Gon was supposed to be Anakin's master and Obi-Wan was ready to move on to the next phase of his training. I do like seeing the friendship, but I also kind of don't like seeing them bickering all the time. Did anybody forget what Obi-Wan said in A New Hope?
He was the best star pilot in the galaxy, and a cunning warrior, and he was a good friend.
We see glimmers of that here and in Revenge of the Sith, but I wanted more of that. I'm not against them having some kind of friction between the two, but if you had some kind of bickering sprinkled throughout their whole loving, caring friendship, that I think could have really gone a long way. All that being said, I really do like the introduction of Anakin and Obi-Wan as they're going up in the elevator. We as the audience do get a really good sense of how much they care for each other as friends, but then it's ruined almost immediately when they have a sit down with Padme.
Annie? My goodness, you've grown.
So have you. Grown more beautiful, I mean.
Don't do that! Not only that,
We'll not go through this exercise again, Anakin. And you will pay attention to my lead.
Why? What? Why else do you think we were assigned to her if not to find the killer?
this moment makes Anakin seem like a child. Now, I've heard some people suggest that what if instead of Anakin blurting out what he says, he just sits there in silence, but we can clearly see that he's frustrated with Obi-Wan, and then he vents his frustrations to Jar Jar afterward. That, I think, would have been a lot better. And another tweaking that I think would have really helped is when he's helping Padme pack her bags to leave for Naboo. When she says to him, "Don't try to grow up too fast," I would have had him say something like, "Yeah, I know, but that's always been my problem. I'm always looking ahead toward the horizon, never right now." What would that remind you of? Something that Yoda once said about Luke. Twice, actually. While we're on the note of Anakin, this is a really big thing that Attack of the Clones had to get right, to show the growing darkness inside of Anakin Skywalker. In this one, it doesn't really come off the way that they were hoping. I know this might be considered blasphemy by Star Wars fans who are going to defend George Lucas at any chance that they get, but I gotta be honest with you guys. I'm not in any way trying to dismiss Hayden Christensen, because I've always thought he was a good choice for Anakin Skywalker. I think that he really could have nailed it, and if his performance in the Kenobi series many years later is any indication, we might have gotten something good out of it with him. And that's really the problem. He was saddled with poor direction and screenwriting by George Lucas. I've seen Hayden Christensen in other things, and he actually does quite well when he's given good material to work with. And one of you guys pointed out to me that Christian Bale should have been Anakin Skywalker. I don't really even think he could have pulled off something like this. This is a poorly written character. And also, for anyone who doesn't know, I actually met Hayden Christensen over a year ago at Philly Comic-Con, albeit a very brief interaction. A very calm, respectful, and very gentle, caring kind of guy. At least that's the vibe I got from him anyway. I just think if we saw more of what he was like in the Kenobi series in these two movies that he showed up in, it would have fared a lot better for him. And I don't really think he deserved all the backlash that he got. But there are quite a few moments where he really does shine. We'll get into that as we go along, though. But I think that really the problem with Anakin in this movie, it's not Hayden Christensen, it's the way that it was constructed on paper by George Lucas. The intention, I think, was to show how awkward Anakin is, because him being sheltered from other people as a Jedi trainee or a Padawan, clearly nobody has taught this guy how to have proper social interaction. As opposed to something like Tobey Maguire's portrayal of Peter Parker in Spider-Man, which came out the same year as Attack of the Clones did, you could say that, yeah, it's a little cheesy and cutesy, but it feels like a genuine expression of how someone feels about the other. It's not just the way he acts like a child or says something that's really awkward and kind of weird. He almost comes off as kind of a perv. Especially in this moment where Padme says to him, "Please don't look at me like that, you're making me uncomfortable." He looks like he's about ready to jump all over her.
Sorry, milady.
Weird.
I guess we're gonna have to talk about the romance. I have never been a fan of this romance. Not at all. This does not in any way strike me as romantic. Anakin is putting off some really big creeper type of vibes here, and Padme is always looking very uncomfortable, but for some reason, she just falls in love with him regardless. I know that people are into different things, but if I were her, I would not want anything to do with him. She's still in love with him despite the fact that he inappropriately touches her, admits that he supports a fascist dictatorship, and admits that he slaughtered women and children in a moment of pure rage. What exactly about him won her over? That being said, I do kind of like the concept of them being together. As I've heard other people talk about, I think what George Lucas was trying to convey is that they're both coming from very restrictive institutions, Anakin with the Jedi, and Padme with her political upbringing on Naboo. And they're both bonding over the fact that they feel restricted by where they come from, so they manage to find some sort of comfort with each other. I don't think the basic story is the problem. It's just who's telling the story and how they told the story. And their time on Naboo feels very just inconsequential and very unnecessary. Like if they were on some other planet trying to avoid being killed by the Separatists, which launched an assassination attempt on her. In fact, it kind of reminds me of the Canto Bite scenes in The Last Jedi. I know, some of you will scream blasphemy at me. What I'm most concerned about is what Obi-Wan is doing by trying to find out what's going on the planet Kamino. And whenever it cuts back to Anakin and Padme, the movie for me kind of loses steam, and I find myself just tapping my foot waiting for it to cut back to Obi-Wan. There are plenty of other better ways to develop some kind of romance, but in this one, I don't really think it fits in a Star Wars movie. Maybe in like a television show, I would be okay with it, but not in one of the saga films. Not like this. But I do have some female friends who really love this movie for the romance. In fact, my one friend, who does my hair every now and then, told me that this movie is her favorite because of the romance between Anakin and Padme. And she also has a crush on Hayden Christensen. Different strokes for different folks, I guess. But we can't talk about the stuff on Naboo without discussing the fireplace scene where Anakin is pouring his heart out to Padme. It's just... it's bad. It's really, really bad. On paper, I would assume it's supposed to come off very heartfelt, but really he just comes off as a simp, and she just very flatly defends herself against him. But then we get this line.
Believe me, I wish that I could just wish away my feelings.
That is so stupid.
You laughed, mother.
Laugh.
Yes, you did.
Jesus, I'm losing it.
You're losing it big time.
You know what? I don't care if I'm gonna get hate for this. That is the absolute, and I mean absolute, worst line of dialogue in all of the Star Wars movies or television shows, period. I know a lot of people like to talk about the I hate sand or somehow Palpatine returned. No. This is the absolute worst of them all. The absolute lowest of the low. However, this line...
I truly, deeply love you.
Not too far behind. Regarding Obi-Wan and Palpatine and the plot to find the clone army and what exactly the plot is to target Padme Amidala. So Padme's being targeted by an assassin, Jango Fett, and his partner Zam Wesell, where they use a droid to sneak into her apartment window, throwing in 2 poisonous worms to kill her in her sleep. Other people have mentioned this, but if I were Jango Fett, I would use something a little more direct, like a laser or a rocket or a bomb or something. I mean, I get that George Lucas wanted to build up some tension in order for you to get on the edge of your seat, but at least for myself, I don't really think it works. Where you're hearing in the background Anakin and Obi-Wan talking about how they feel about the Senate and Palpatine and how Anakin's feeling worried about his mother. Which I do really like that one moment where he thinks about what his mother's been up to after all this time, but then it's ruined when he goes,
I'd much rather dream about Padme. Just being around her again is intoxicating.
Oh, mother of God.
The Coruscant chase I actually quite like, even though they don't really come off as very concerned or worried, except for one small moment when they're diving down after Zam and they're about to hit this big ship.
Sorry, Master. I forgot you don't like flying.
I don't mind flying, but what you're doing is suicide.
I still quote that interaction to this day. And I have to mention John Williams' music, in particular this moment when Zam has her sniper rifle pointing at Obi-Wan, the drums and percussion are kicking up. Your thoughts on the movie aside, you cannot deny the mastery of John Williams. Not to mention the sound design by Ben Burt. If you were to watch this with just the sound on, this is a treat for the ears. So they eventually track Zam Wesell down to this bar, which right away gives me flashbacks to Star Wars The Bounty Hunter video game. Besides the asteroid prison section, the Coruscant section was also another favorite of mine. And this game's a ton of fun. I had a great time playing this when I was a kid. And something I noticed as they walk into the bar and they're looking for Zam, the lighting on Obi-Wan's hair looked really flashy and clean. And that's when I remember that this film was shot on digital along with Revenge of the Sith, as opposed to The Phantom Menace, which I believe was shot on film. Personally, I don't really have a preference to which one a filmmaker uses. In the case of Attack of the Clones, I think it's a little bit too clean and glossy, though in some shots it does make the film really good, but since it came out 22 years ago with the CGI that's thrown in here, it's gonna look very noticeable, and I think in certain shots it really does look like they're on a green screen set. I don't really like to focus too much on that, as a lot of people have had over the years, because honestly, it doesn't really bother me that much, but if you're really paying close attention to that kind of stuff, it can really take you out of it. The small moments that we get in this sequence when we see Obi-Wan using the Jedi mind trick on a guy who offers him death sticks. Oh yeah, and this guy right here is Ahmed Best, who played Jar Jar. And here's Anthony Daniels, who is known as C-3PO. But if I'm being perfectly frank with all of you, everybody likes to talk about how Maz Kanata's castle in Force Awakens is too derivative of the cantina scene in A New Hope. We literally have a cantina scene in Attack of the Clones. How come it was fine then, but it's not in The Force Awakens? Also, if Jango Fett can shoot a dart from afar and killing Sam Wizell like that, why couldn't he do the same thing with Padme if he had a good shot at her in the open? I know I'm going into the nitpicking territory. It's just those little things I think really could have benefited George Lucas, and allowing other people to challenge him and say, George, why don't we just do it this way? I know, same old tired criticism, but I just can't help but notice these things. As for Palpatine's plan to start a war, like I said, there's really not much of an explanation as to what led to the separation of the systems from the Republic. A couple of scenes would have really helped, at least maybe one or two, or one conversation from Count Dooku, played by the late Christopher Lee, I think would have really cleared the air on that. But when you really start to think about it, at least in my estimation, the assassination plot against Padme, with Jango Fett assigned to kill Padme, acting on orders from Darth Tyrannus, or Count Dooku, who's the apprentice of Emperor Palpatine, creating this clone army in secret for the last 10 years or so, needing Padme supposedly to be wiped out from the picture, knowing that she could possibly oppose his new order to introduce an army for the Republic to counter the threat of the Separatists. There were so many things that could have gone wrong with this plan, but everything seemed to be going exactly just right. And this only carries on into Revenge of the Sith, but if you're really paying close attention to any details, at least for me, my head really starts to spin, like, wait a minute. Does he really know that he was going to have all this stuff play out in his favor? And also, what really gets me is when he announces his army for the Republic, the Clone Army, nobody in the Senate really seems to question what he's doing. We don't even get a hint that somebody's saying, wait. What are you trying to pull with this? And when Obi-Wan goes to investigate on Kamino, they're all expecting him, and he's just going along with it like, oh, yeah, oh, okay, well, let's see what happens. Kind of bouncing around all over the place, just like with the whole notion of Palpatine's plot. But when they get to the design of the clones and we see how they're structured, they grow to a full mature adult within a 10-year period. This is basically the start of what we know now in the original trilogy and in the sequel trilogy as the Stormtroopers. These are all created on the physical design of a bounty hunter called Jango Fett, who had the first clone for himself, no growth acceleration, no alterations of any kind, who we now know as the famous Boba Fett bounty hunter in Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, and The Mandalorian. And I think the actor's name was Daniel Logan, who played Boba Fett. Everybody has said that he was horrible in this movie, but I don't really have any high expectations for kid actors. He's fine, but his introduction is kind of awkward.
Is your father here?
Yep.
May we see him?
Sure.
When we see Jango Fett without his armor on and he's having that interaction with Obi-Wan, I do kind of like the tension that's lingering in the air. You can clearly see that Obi-Wan's realizing that this is the bounty hunter that he's been searching for, and we hear the mention of how he was recruited by Darth Tyrannus on one of the moons of Bogdan. I mean, anyone who's played the bounty hunter video game, we all know what that's all about. But being realistic, I would have liked at least some clarification in this movie anyway. Not an info dump, but just enough to give us an idea of what happened. Oh yeah, and did I mention that when they talk about Master Sifo Dyas being the one to commission the clone army, this is the one part where it kind of starts to get interesting, and when he investigates what's going on with the clone army, and then it's revealed that Master Sifo Dyas was killed about a decade ago, but that plotline doesn't go anywhere. And when he brings it up to the attention of Mace Windu and Master Yoda, they don't really seem fazed by the fact that there's secretly an army being built, yet they just accept it without any question. Not only that, but Mace Windu says to Padme earlier on, Count Dooku couldn't assassinate anyone, he was once a Jedi. If he was once a Jedi, doesn't that mean that his character traits are different from when he was a Jedi. And once again, the Jedi are complete morons in here. There's so many red flags that are thrown in their faces from the clone army that's commissioned, and they have no idea why. They're supposedly created by a Jedi who they had no idea was creating it in the first place. And from what I gather, they don't really dig anywhere into it to see where these guys came from. I know some of you out there are going to say that's the point, they're supposed to be flawed and idiotic, but that does not make it a good creative decision. There's a big difference between the Jedi losing their way and falling, and then becoming complete idiots and falling. I would rather prefer the former over the latter. We'll get more into that when we talk about Revenge of the Sith, but what George Lucas does with the Jedi here, it does not help. And the fact that Jedi are not allowed to love anybody, it's not original coming from me. It's really, I think it's quite dumb. No attachments of any kind when they're supposedly caring for each other, and yet they have to act so stoic and put on a poker face every time. I mean, I know that's the point, that they're supposed to be dogmatic and so flawed that it would eventually lead to their downfall. But again, there's other ways you could have done this. I don't know how exactly I would have done it, but maybe if you were to watch something from Belated Media a long time ago, if I don't remember correctly if he explained this or not, maybe we could have actually seen a better way of the Jedi falling to their demise rather than the way that George Lucas presents it here. I do really like the fight between Obi-Wan and Jango on the platform when it's raining outside. As opposed to some of the other action set pieces in here, it's very atmospheric and it's clumsy. It feels like a real fight between two people. And this moment right here where Obi-Wan says, "Oh, not good," does add some humanity to the character for me, even though there's really no character development to him at all. Really, Ewan McGregor is kind of, in a way, I guess, the saving grace of this movie, as far as the acting is concerned, because he's the only one in this entire cast, besides maybe Hayden Christensen, who acts like a human being. And then we later see him chasing after Jango in the asteroid field above Geonosis. We've obviously seen asteroid field sequences like the one in Empire Strikes Back. The only difference is, nobody gets really scared in this one as they go into the asteroid field, whereas in Empire Strikes Back they go, "Wait, you're not going into an asteroid field, are you? They'd be crazy to follow us, wouldn't they?" The sequence is really just kind of passable and forgettable, but what really stands out for me whenever I think about this sequence is the explosion effect of the seismic charge, and the sound effect too. They even brought it back in that one episode of Season 2 of The Mandalorian, even including it in Star Wars Rogue Squadron 3 Rebel Strike when you fight above Geonosis, in an old Jedi starfighter. So while Obi-Wan figures out what's going on Geonosis with the Separatist leaders, Anakin has a nightmare about his mother dying. This is where I think the characterization of Anakin starts to improve drastically, because he decides to abandon his mission to go find out what's going on with his mother. And we learn that Shmi actually married someone and has 2 stepchildren. Well, actually, I take that back. 1 stepchild, Owen Lars, played by the one and only Joel Edgerton. I do like seeing how Owen is connected to Luke Skywalker in that way, especially since his Aunt Beru was Owen's girlfriend at the time. I just think the introduction could have been a little bit better, where Anakin's response could have been more like, "Wait, my stepbrother?" And then we later learn from Shmi's husband, Klieg Lars, that she was kidnapped by Tusken Raiders. Anakin's just sitting there absorbing all of this information, and we can clearly see that he's upset by what he's hearing. Not blurting out his emotions like he was earlier, but he's really taking it all in. He decides to take action to go find her, and this is what I wanted to see from Anakin in the beginning of the movie. Now, I'm not saying that I don't want him to talk about his feelings at all, but I think a little more of this would have really helped his characterization. So he eventually finds his mother being held hostage, in a scene that's admittedly very emotional, that she gets to see her son in her dying moments. For Anakin, who really wears his emotions on his sleeve, you can really tell that this means a lot to him that he finally got to see his mother, considering how he felt so bad leaving her behind the way he did. Hayden Christensen actually does a pretty good job in this scene. His response actually got me, but then it shifts to complete rage and anger, and we see Darth Vader fully coming out of him for the first time. Unfortunately, it's cut short by the cut to the next scene with Yoda and Mace Windu. I did like seeing that brief look of it though. And of course, the next part when he talks to Padme about how he slaughtered all the sand people. I have mixed feelings on this scene, to be honest with you. Hayden actually does a pretty good job in the scene, conveying how broken up he is over losing his mother, how he wasn't able to save her. What really ruins it for me though is when Padme says this.
To be angry is to be human.
What? Are you kidding me? One giant red flag after another with these two. Not to mention that earlier he supported a fascist dictatorship. And you could see from the look on her face that she's thinking, what? Any other normal person would go, this is a crazy person. I don't buy that they would become a couple after all that stuff. As for Count Dooku, played by the late Christopher Lee, I don't really find anything to be that compelling about him. Except for the scene where he interacts with Obi-Wan where he's being held prisoner, and he tells him that there's a secret Sith Lord infiltrating the Republic. Obi-Wan denies it, saying, "No, I don't believe you. We would have been aware of it." No, you wouldn't have been, actually, because you guys are complete morons for not seeing a red flag when it's right in front of you, but anyway. There is a subtle look, though, in Obi-Wan's eyes that I've been able to pick up, where he starts to think, wait a minute, is this a bunch of BS, or is he telling the truth?
Must join me, Obi-Wan. And together, we will destroy the Sith.
That to me, I think, felt like a genuine plea for help. Maybe Count Dooku felt some doubts about his apprenticeship under Palpatine, but again, like with a lot of other stuff in this movie, that doesn't go anywhere. So Anakin and Padme end up on Geonosis, and they go through the infamous conveyor belt sequence. There's nothing really bad to criticize about this. It's just some kind of fun obstacle for them to get through, and then they eventually get captured and brought out into the arena, with all of these different creatures that are going to come after each of them. Then the Jedi later show up to help them get out, fighting off all the battle droids that come into attack. And I know this is not in the movie, but a lot of people have asked how did they get into the arena. The Clone Wars video game from 2002 explains this. I know it doesn't count since it's not in the movie, but knowing what happens in here, it does add to it for me. And another game that I have a lot of nostalgia for. It's a really fun game to play. I do like seeing the Jedi in action and the inevitable arrival of the clone army as they're wiping out all of the battle droids. And one thing that I noticed upon rewatch is seeing this Jedi step into the gunship looks exactly like the same species as Ahsoka Tano. As for the Battle of Geonosis itself, it's just really a bunch of spectacle and flashy stuff and really not much else. It's cool to look at. And if you're looking at it from a lore perspective, a lot of fans who are into the expanded universe stuff are really going to have a kick out of this. I don't really think there's a whole lot of purpose to this battle. Maybe I'm alone in that. I don't know. No, actually, it's because the Jedi just accepted that they're going to lead this army and they don't understand why they're here in the first place. So that's really the only reason. Then they chase after Count Dooku as he tries to get away, and Padme gets knocked out of the ship. Anakin insists on putting the ship down to go get her, but I really like how Obi-Wan draws the line here and says, "No, I have let go of every shenanigan that you've thrown around in here. But I'm drawing the line in this one. You are a Jedi, you do what you're supposed to do." Knowing how he turns out in Revenge of the Sith by the time it starts, I do like kind of seeing the evolution of what he becomes. He clearly is given a serious humbling, along with what happens to him in the lightsaber fight between him and Count Dooku. And the lightsaber fight itself is actually... ugh. And then when Anakin faces off against Count Dooku, we get these flashing images back and forth. I've always found that to be really weird. I never understood what that was all about. Was that some kind of artistic indie vision that Lucas was going for? The hell if I know. But then Yoda shows up, and we see a Force lightning duel between him and Count Dooku. I do like seeing some of that, but when it gets to the lightsaber stuff, that's where everybody just puts their foot down and says, "Nope, Stonewall, movie's not good anymore." How do I feel about Yoda using a lightsaber? I loved it when I was a kid. I thought it was amazing. Looking at it as an adult and hearing what other people have had to say about it, it's, I never hated the idea of him using a lightsaber, but I don't remember him saying that I don't need a lightsaber, I can use the Force as my ally. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't remember hearing him say anything like that in Empire. I think what would really help, though, is if he had a moment of hesitation right after Count Dooku pulls out his lightsaber. Like if Yoda were to just sigh in frustration, like he was saying, "I guess we'll have to do this the hard way." And John Knoll, who was one of the VFX supervisors for this film, he actually argued with George Lucas, saying that Yoda doesn't really need to use a lightsaber. It should be really just a duel between sorcerers like what we see in Akira. I think that would have been a really interesting showdown. And if they decided to go with the lightsaber fight anyway, but throw more of the Akira-like stuff into the mix, that I think would have been really amazing. And it gives that sense of honor in the fight that we see in the original trilogy and even in the sequels with the lightsaber duels. And yeah, I'll include the prequels on that one. So basically the battle's over. There's a long way to go with the war. Anakin and Padme get married, which I guess that was inevitably going to happen, but I really do like the ending in the movie, mostly because of the music by John Williams. I can't play it because of copyright reasons, but if you were to listen to this music as the scene's playing, where Yoda says, "Begun the Clone War has," and we see the clone army standing in formation, marching onto the assault ships, that was used in the Clone Wars video game, and that takes me right back to that era of my life when I was 12 years old. Doesn't really end on a note of complete hopelessness, but there is sort of an eerie feeling with us knowing what's going to happen in the next chapter. So I do kind of like seeing these seeds of all that stuff that's starting to happen. I mean, there's a whole lot of other stuff that I didn't even mention, like the interaction that we see between Anakin and Palpatine, where Palpatine says that he's the most gifted Jedi that he's ever met. Seeing those little next steps into what eventually their friendship would turn into, knowing that he's really the only one Anakin can talk to about his frustrations, besides maybe Padme. But even then, everybody talks about how great of a Jedi Anakin is, but we don't really see anything that really adds to what Palpatine was talking about, or any other Jedi for that matter. Oh my god, I completely forgot about Jar Jar giving the emergency powers to Palpatine. I could not help but wonder, was that a big giant middle finger from George Lucas to all the haters of Jar Jar Binks? I could be speculating on that one, and I don't want to put words in his mouth. I get the feeling he was saying to the audience, okay, you hated this guy last time? Now you're really gonna hate him. He basically caused all the events of the original trilogy and even later the sequel trilogy to happen. I don't really know what else to say about that, other than the fact that George Lucas is such a troll. But really, at the end of the day, Attack of the Clones is alright, I guess. In a lot of ways, I would say it's pretty bad. The romance really drags it down, and some of the stuff involving the assassination plot, the creation of an army, starting a war with the Separatists, it's just not really that well thought out, and it gets very confusing if you really start to look at it with an ounce of scrutiny. It's more or less the same as what we saw with Phantom Menace. Flat acting, barely any characterizations, and really no sense of urgency. The only thing that I think really elevates this movie above Phantom Menace for me, by just a small margin, is the focus on Anakin and Padme. It at least attempts to develop the characters in some capacity. And there is some sort of relevance going on in the overall plot. I wouldn't exactly elect to watch Attack of the Clones on a regular basis. It's definitely on the bottom of the barrel for Star Wars ranking as far as I'm concerned, but you can certainly watch it like Phantom Menace and still have some fun with it. It has enough scenes in there for me to say, you know what, if I was in the mood for it, I could put it on TV. And just like with the other two prequels, it does in a lot of ways bring me right back to my youth when I first saw this. So those are my thoughts on Attack of the Clones. Thank you guys so much for watching. Comment below and tell me what your thoughts are on this movie, and thank you for bearing with me as I battle through my hay fever. Just please try to keep it civil down below in the comments section. Stay tuned for more reviews coming up very soon, and as always, see you in the next one.